Low oil pressure diagnosis. If you have other types of classic cars besides Mercedes, or really any car, this is a good video to watch. So welcome to my channel. If you're not a Mercedes owner, maybe one day you'll become one. Today we're going to talk about one of the most frustrating problems you can encounter with a classic car, and that is the diagnosis of low oil pressure. So we usually diagnose low oil pressure as being oil pressure that does not fit the average or median oil pressure of a group of similar cars or engines. So if I were to look at the average oil pressure, for example, of 300D turbo diesels, I'm looking at hot idle oil pressure. I'm looking at cold oil pressure. I'm looking at the speed at which the engine pegs the gauge and hits 45 psi or 3 bar of oil pressure. So these are the three metrics that I'm looking at. Now, on using our example car, the 300D turbo or 300 SD, both 116 and 126 chassis versions, most of these cars will have maximum oil pressure by 1100 to 1200 RPMs in a hot climate like Florida. And at idle, they'll have around 25 to 30 psi or 1.5 to 2 bar of oil pressure. These are normal numbers. I would start to be suspicious if I see oil pressure numbers that are below 1.2 bar at idle, or around just over 15 psi. And then I know there's really a problem if it's below 15 psi or 1 bar, when I start to see it dip below that. Now Mercedes says half a bar at idle and 3 bar 45 psi. A bar is about 15 psi by 3000 RPM, which is a little ridiculous if you ask me. I would be alarmed at any car that was making these numbers. So the numbers are really misleading, at least the acceptable numbers that Mercedes publishes. Now, on the gas Mercedes, especially cars with the M103 engine, these numbers might be a little bit lower. We see a lot of M103 engines that idle with half a bar of oil pressure and usually peg their gauge by about 1500 RPM. One of the things we're going to talk about is when you should be concerned about oil pressure dropping or oil pressure loss, and then where oil pressure can go in an engine if it is falling. Now, if you're driving down the road and you see that your oil pressure is lower and lower and lower and lower, you've got a problem. If you see it dramatically drop off of the top of the gauge while you're going down the road, you've got a really big problem. You need to shut the car off and pull over immediately. I remember years ago, one of my friends had an 82 300D. He probably is still watching this channel, so I don't want to say any names, but he couldn't shut the car off. He had to keep going, and he blew an oil cooler hose and blew an engine too, because his car drained itself within a minute. And he was trying to get to safe space, and he should have just shut the motor off and threw in his hazard lights and prayed to God that he didn't get hit. But you don't have 2 minutes or a minute, you have seconds. I remember I had an experience with a 71 220D where the oil cooler exploded. It ruptured in half. It literally tore open, and it was about 11 o'clock at night. I was driving in the middle of nowhere, and I was really tired. As in, I was super tired, but I saw the gauge dip just for a second, and then I saw it dip again, and I shut the car off. Now, thankfully, I just bought oil for the shop. I had a bunch of oil in the car, and I nursed the car home. But the leak was bad. So that leads me to my first thing. If you get a sudden drop, you have an oil pressure leak somewhere. Usually on Mercedes, it's the oil pressure line, oil cooler lines, the gauge line, the oil cooler itself, which you should never rule out, or maybe if you have a turbo diesel, a turbo drain tube that's leaking badly and splattered oil everywhere. Usually you'll see a big mess. But the thing I really want to focus on is the silent, gradual oil pressure losses. So let's say you buy a car like a 280 SL, and you notice that you have a half a bar of oil pressure hot, and then it takes about 2,500 RPM to build maximum oil pressure. Then you should start looking for additional causes for the problem. So additional cause number one that I always like to focus on is whether or not it has bottom end wear. Bottom end wear meaning main bearing and connecting rod wear, and if it has a certain amount and you start seeing metal, then that's actually main bearing or connecting rod failure. So what you're going to do is pull the lower oil pan and look for debris, and then if you find debris in there, time for an engine rebuild. Sure, it gets expensive, but somebody overheated the engine / ran out of oil / had contaminated oil in there and it wiped out the bearings. Another place that you can lose oil pressure, albeit less oil pressure, is in the top end at the number 1 cam bearing on Mercedes straight 6 engines or diesel engines, or at the back cam journal, the number 5 cam journal on gas V8 Mercedes engines. It's very important on these engines to try to figure out where your oil pressure is going, because these big gas V8 Mercedes engines are notorious, I think that's the word I should be using, they're notorious for wearing out cam bearings if the cam oil or tubes pop. And sometimes when these repairs get undertaken, somebody may leave the 5th bearing journal or whatever, they don't fix it the right way, or they bore all of them too big. Usually it's about the repairs that have happened in the past, but it can also be caused by cam wear from low oil supply. So that's another. The last one is going to be a little bit more interesting. The worn oil pump diagnosis is usually a diagnosis I reserve as a last place diagnosis. Some people put an oil pump in and it makes no difference, and that's what I find most of the time. There are oil pressure check valves in your engine, usually in the front timing cover area, that can also leak down, but again, for these to fail, it's exceedingly rare. What we usually see when we have these kinds of failures is that the oil pump is working fine or well enough because a little bit of wear shouldn't impact it, and it's causing oil pressure to dip so low that there's an oil pressure loss somewhere else that's causing the pressure to dip so low you think there's not enough pressure to begin with. Well, there is. There's plenty of it. But anytime you have an engine that has low oil pressure, especially if somebody says, I ran out of oil or something, you really should try to investigate the root cause. And this is why I always tell people, test drive the Mercedes before you commit, because you need to make sure that you don't have a major problem waiting for you deep inside the motor. Anyway, if you've learned something from this video, please like it and share it, and maybe with somebody else who has a classic Mercedes. And if you're not a subscriber, we'd love to have you. If you are trying to diagnose a low oil pressure issue on your own Mercedes, start by pulling the oil pan and looking for debris. And I wish you good luck, and I hope this never happens to you. We'll see you in the next video.